Will we soon see U.S. troops on the ground in the Middle East? Well, Biden officials have indicated to Israel in recent days that if Hezbollah initiates a war against Israel, the U.S. military will join the IDF in fighting the terror group. Officials with knowledge of the matter have told the Times of Israel. Per reporting from Jacob Majid, the Biden administration has privately been urging Israel not to launch a military campaign against Hezbollah as Washington works to keep the current war from spreading beyond Gaza.
Despite Biden's private efforts to rein in Netanyahu and the IDF, Israel's endgame remains increasingly unclear. There is no sign of a post-war plan for Gaza, Reuters reports. One regional security official told the outlet, quote, "Their strategy is to drop thousands of bombs, destroy everything, and go in. But then what? They have no exit strategy for the day after." This comes as cracks of instability continue to appear across the region. Saudi Arabia is urging its citizens to depart Lebanon amid Hezbollah threats. And the State Department is currently warning Americans not to travel to Lebanon. Joining us now to weigh in on all of this is Dr. Trita Parsi, Executive Director at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Welcome back, Dr. Parsi.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, help us understand why this warning of Saudi Arabia to get its people out of Lebanon is so ominous, and what other signs you see that this conflict is only getting bigger.
Well, the reason why this is quite ominous is because if Israel goes in with a land invasion into Gaza, that appears to be the most likely trigger for Hezbollah to step into the war. And that would mean that there would be a two-front war. And last time that happened, or last time Israel and Lebanon had a war, was in 2006. You had Israeli mass bombings of Lebanon, which got a lot of Americans stuck in Lebanon and tremendous difficulty actually evacuating them from there. So it's not just Saudi Arabia. The United States State Department is also urging Americans to leave Lebanon right now, and that seems to be an indication of an expectation, or at least an assessment of a high risk that Israel is going to go in to Gaza, and that will lead to Hezbollah stepping into the war. What that further will lead to is an expansion of the war in the sense that the United States likely is going to get dragged into it because Iran is going to get dragged into it. And then we will have not only a crisis in Ukraine, a potential crisis in Taiwan, but also yet another unwinnable, unnecessary war in the Middle East that the United States is a part of.
I obviously can't speak for all of the American people. It seems there's some still strong memory of our failures in the Middle East in recent decades. I'm sure the American people have divided opinions on what should be done, how they feel about what's happening. I don't think there is anywhere near universal support for greater U.S. involvement to the point of troops in the region. Joe Biden, in his statements about what's going on, has obviously affirmed that he thinks Israel should defend itself and take a lot of the actions it's taking, and we're sending them support, although he has urged caution for the harming of civilians. What do you think he ought to do, or even can do, to prevent this kind of escalation that it seems to me the American people are certainly not universally behind?
I think the critical thing is to make sure that there is not a land invasion and that we get to a ceasefire and the release of the hostages. I know that is a tough message for the Israelis, but the United States has a lot of experience in this, and so does incidentally Israel. Israel has been in these wars over and over again and has not been able to achieve peace through war on the battlefield. The United States went in to take out al-Qaeda and the Taliban government in Afghanistan 20 plus years ago. Invaded the country, occupied it for 20 years, and guess what? The Taliban are still in power in Afghanistan today. So the idea that there is a military solution, however much the rage and the anger right now wishes to see such a solution, does not mean that they actually exist. And good advice to an ally in this situation would be to not just caution them, but to also pressure them not to do anything that would be bad for them, that would also then drag the United States into this war. The fact that the president is indicating or messages are out there won't be any ground troops in it actually does not matter. Because what will happen in this scenario is that other militias throughout the region will start targeting American bases where American ground troops already are, particularly in the Persian Gulf. We've already seen some drone attacks against US bases in Iraq. So even if not more ground troops are brought into the region as part of this war, does not mean that American troops in the region will not end up in harm's way and end up in that war.
It does seem like President Biden has been unwilling to say much when it comes to asking Israel to exercise restraint publicly, although there has been reporting about him privately urging against a ground war. It does seem, though, like the most persuasive thing that he could say to Netanyahu is that you cannot rely on a commitment of our troops if you do pursue this cause of action. I mean, I've also been speaking to some experts who say that Hezbollah is a very seasoned, well-trained, active fighting force as compared to the IDF, and that some of the mythology around Israel's military being the very high quality and very effective are misplaced, aren't really true, and were also kind of revealed to be not really true on October 7th, when, in that unprecedented and horrible way, the terrorist attack was able to take place. So why don't you think that Joe Biden is using that leverage, saying you cannot rely on American ground troops, you should conduct yourself accordingly? And what are the risks of Israel going at it alone? Can they even sustain and survive but for American support?
Well, last time when Israel did go in 2006, it ended up essentially being defeated by Hezbollah. And so there's much to say that Hezbollah, which has had a very significant number of battle-hardened troops because of their participation in the Syrian civil war, have at this point greater experience in warfare than many of those on the Israeli side. Now, whether that will be decisive or not, I'm not a military expert to comment on. But I think the larger point you're making is a very valid one that has to be asked, which is, if we are truly trying to prevent an escalation, if the president truly is seeking a way to make sure that this war does not expand and that the United States does not get dragged into it, why has he adopted an approach that publicly gives Israel a complete green light while deterring Iran and Hezbollah, rather one that also publicly signals and makes clear to Hezbollah and to Iran that the United States is also trying to deter Israel from expanding the war? The message Hezbollah and Iran are receiving essentially is that the US is giving a green light, which then increases their suspicion that when Israel has mobilized 350,000 troops, that is not just for going into Gaza, it's also to later on go into Lebanon. That may be a false perception. That may not be Israel's intent. But the strategy of giving Israel complete support and a green light, I fear, is undermining the larger objective that the administration says that it does have, which is to prevent the escalation that can bring the U.S. into the war.
Yeah, Biden said in his recent remarks, he said, later this week, I'm going to ask the United States Congress for an unprecedented support package for Israel's defense. We're going to keep Iron Dome fully supplied. We moved the U.S. military assets to the region, including the USS Ford Carrier Strike Group, the USS Eisenhower on the way. That sounds like full-throated, that sounds like whatever they need whenever they need it. And if we were giving them all this support, we should be in a position to not just gently caution, like, hey, let's make sure we don't start World War III here, but to demand these are the terms of this support. Why doesn't the U.S. ever do that when as it offers support to all sorts of countries and all sorts of reasons? We seem to not get the policies that we want, or at least the policies that the American people want, which I don't think is open-ended commitment and ground troops.
It is unfortunately the pattern that we've seen for a very long time, an outdated and, in my view, political miscalculation that the United States has to essentially completely be on the side of Israel in manners that actually are not in the interests of the U.S. It's one thing to support Israel. It's a completely different thing to do it to the extent that we're seeing right now. The other signal that this sends is that if we are saying that either we're not willing, or as some people close to the administration are saying, that we can't exercise that leverage over Israel, then what signal does that send to the rest of the region? We saw how many of these states canceled their meeting with Biden and in many ways embarrassed Biden's entire trip to the region. But if we're saying that we don't have leverage with the Israelis, then why should some of these Arab states expect that diplomacy with the United States is going to be fruitful. If the U.S. cannot deliver Israel and it cannot deliver the Arab states, then what is the basis of America being able to be an effective mediator and peacemaker in this conflict? So I think it lies in our own interest to build on that credibility, to make sure that we can put pressure on both sides, we can be tough on both sides, we can deliver both sides, rather than what we're doing right now. All of these different military assets moving to the region. You had in Congress, the Republicans have introduced an authorization of use of force against Iran in Congress. All of these things to deter Iran and Hezbollah, but almost nothing publicly to also signal that the United States is going to try to rein in Israel and make sure that Israel doesn't do anything that leads to an escalation.
Dr. Parsi, Joe Biden has said Israel is of such geopolitical significance to us. If it didn't already exist, I would have invented it. Is there something in that is clarifying as to why Biden isn't being more forceful with Israel right now? Is there something that we're missing about what Israel means to America in terms of its military significance, our ability to have a place to put troops and weapons in the area? Is there something that's really significant here that we're missing?
We're not missing a thing, and the United States does not have troops in Israel. The Israelis don't want U.S. troops in Israel. We are not missing a thing when it comes to the geopolitical calculation. It was a different situation during the Cold War, in which Israel was an ally of the United States against the Soviets. At that point, there was a strategic basis for that relationship. After the end of the Cold War, according to the Israelis themselves, the strategic logic underpinning that relationship was significantly weakened. And as a result, you saw a change of the language on the Israeli and the American side, in which the justification for this relationship was no longer put forward in terms of strategic calculations, but rather that these are two countries with shared values. That ended up becoming the basis for the relationship, not a geopolitical calculation.
Very interesting observation. Dr. Parsi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.